If you grew up in Cape Breton, you grew up knowing what the Sydney steel plant meant. The paychecks that kept the town alive. The orange glow over the harbor at night that told you the furnace was still running. The fathers and grandfathers who walked through those same gates for 3 generations. At its peak, the plant employed nearly 6,000 workers on a site that stretched along the harbor like a small city. They survived 2 world wars, survived the collapse of the coal industry that fed them, survived strikes, bankruptcy, government takeover, and the slow retreat of heavy industry from every corner of the country. And then, after a century of making steel in Cape Breton, the furnace went dark for the last time. How does something that held a community together for 100 years simply go silent? What happened? Chapter 1. The Speculator and the Seam. The story begins on the eastern edge of a country still figuring out what it wanted to be. Cape Breton Island, in the 1890s, was a place most Canadians couldn't find on a map. A rock jutting into the North Atlantic at the far end of Nova Scotia, battered by fog and winter gales, connected to the mainland by a strait narrow enough to see across. Sydney, the old colonial capital, held about 2,400 people. The harbor was deep and sheltered. The coal seams, thick veins of bituminous black, ran so close to the surface that you could see them in the cliff faces along the shore. The Mi'kmaq had burned surface coal for centuries. Scottish settlers had mined it in small operations since the 1700s. But nobody had thought to build an empire on it. Confederation was barely a generation old. The national policy tariffs, erected in the 1870s to shelter Canadian industry from cheaper American and British goods, were doing exactly what Sir John A. Macdonald had intended, creating hothouse conditions for domestic manufacturing. Federal bounties paid cash for every ton of iron and steel produced on Canadian soil. Provincial governments, desperate for investment and the employment it brought, were prepared to offer terms that would look reckless from any distance. And into this opening, carrying plans drawn up in a Boston office by men who'd never set foot in a coal mine, stepped the figure around whom this entire story turns. Henry Melville Whitney was born in 1839 in Conway, Massachusetts, a Connecticut River Valley town about as far from Cape Breton, in every sense, as a man could get while remaining in the same hemisphere. He was old Puritan stock, the kind of New England lineage that carried weight in the boardrooms of Boston. His father was Brigadier General James Scollay Whitney. His younger brother, William Collins Whitney, served as United States Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland from 1885 to 1889, a cabinet position that placed the Whitney name at the center of American political power. Henry had no interest in politics. He had no interest in the military. He had an appetite for building things and a gift for convincing other men to pay for them. By the late 1880s, Whitney had made his name and a substantial fortune running the West End Street Railway Company of Boston. He'd electrified the city's streetcar network at a time when most American transit still depended on horses, and the conversion had made him rich. He also operated the Metropolitan Steamship Company, moving passengers and freight along the eastern seaboard. Both businesses consumed enormous quantities of coal. His streetcars ran on electricity generated by coal-fired plants. His steamships burned coal by the hundreds of tons. Whitney understood coal the way a baker understands flour, not as a commodity, but as the thing that made everything else possible. And somewhere in the late 1880s, someone pointed him toward Cape Breton. What he found there was seductive in its simplicity. Coal, more of it than New England could dream of, sitting in thick seams beneath a landscape that the rest of Canada had largely ignored. The mines that existed were small, locally run, and poorly capitalized. The provincial government was eager for investment. Whitney saw what promoters have always seen in undervalued assets: the gap between what something was worth and what people thought it was worth. He saw consolidation. He saw scale. He saw, in a place that took 3 days to reach from his Boston office, the fuel supply for something much larger than a streetcar company. In 1889, he assembled the syndicate that would reshape Cape Breton. Frederick Stark Pearson, a brilliant American electrical engineer who'd helped design the Boston streetcar electrification, brought technical credibility and an appetite for large-scale ventures that would later take him to Brazil and Mexico. Benjamin Franklin Pearson, no relation to Frederick, despite the surname, was a Halifax lawyer and businessman who provided the Nova Scotia connections, without which no deal with the provincial government could proceed. Together, the three men approached Premier William Stevens Fielding. What they received was extraordinary, even by the standards of an era when governments competed for capital the way minor league towns compete for franchises. Fielding's Liberal government granted the Whitney Syndicate a 99-year lease on virtually all the coal lands east of Sydney Harbour, at a fixed royalty that would look more generous with every passing decade as coal prices rose and the royalty stayed frozen. It was the foundation of everything that followed, and it was, in hindsight, the first of many deals where the people of Cape Breton provided the resource and someone from away kept the profit. On February 1, 1893, the Dominion Coal Company was incorporated with Whitney as president. Within a few years, he'd swallowed nearly every independent colliery in the region. By 1912, Dominion Coal would operate 16 mines, producing roughly 40% of all the coal in Canada. Cape Breton, which had been a backwater at the edge of the Maritimes, was suddenly the fuel depot of a nation. But coal wasn't the endgame. Coal was the stepping stone. Whitney had looked at that deep harbor, and he'd seen something bigger. Chapter 2. An Empire Built on Impurities. The logic was beautiful. Cape Breton had coal for the coke ovens. Bell Island, off the coast of Newfoundland, the deposit called Wabana, had iron ore in quantities large enough to feed a steel operation for generations. Limestone flux could be quarried at Point Edward, at Marble Mountain on the Brasdor Lakes, and at Aguathuna in Newfoundland. Sydney Harbour could receive deep-draft ore ships and was connected by rail to central Canada. The national policy tariffs kept foreign steel out. Federal bounties rewarded every ton of domestic production. And the man who controlled the coal already controlled the first and most expensive input. Whitney looked at this convergence: coal, ore, limestone, harbour, railway, tariff wall, and government incentive, and declared that Sydney offered more advantages than anywhere else in the world for making steel. It was the kind of statement that sounds visionary when things work out and reckless when they don't. On March 30, 1899, the Dominion Iron and Steel Company, SYSCO as it became known, was incorporated. The partners he assembled read like a directory of Gilded Age ambition on both sides of the border. Frederick Stark Pearson brought the engineering mind. B.F. Pearson brought the political network. Brother William Collins Whitney, fresh from the Navy Department, brought American capital and the credibility of a name that Wall Street recognized. Charles T. Barney and Henry F. Dimmock were New York financiers. A. H. Paget represented London money. J. S. McLennan provided local knowledge and the Cape Breton connections. Between them, they pooled enough capital to build what was billed as the largest integrated steel mill in the British Empire. The incentives from Sydney and the province sweetened the pot further. A 500-acre site on the south side of the harbour, tax-free for 30 years. Free water from the municipality. Provincial tax exemptions on top of the federal bounties. Ron Crawley, the historian who documented these arrangements, laid out the full package. And even by the deal-making standards of 1899, it was generous. Sydney was giving away nearly everything it had in exchange for the promise of something transformative. Construction began in June 1899, and Sydney began to change in ways that nobody could have predicted a decade earlier. Workers arrived from everywhere: Scots and Irish, who knew heavy industry from the old country. Newfoundlanders crossing the Cabot Strait for wages their outports couldn't provide. Poles, Ukrainians, Croatians, and Italians, who'd crossed an ocean and then crossed most of a continent to reach this harbor town at the edge of the map. Workers from the American South. West Indians, Barbadians, mainly, who formed a community that would endure for a century. Sydney incorporated as a city. By 1921, its population would exceed 20,000. It was the largest and fastest transformation the Maritimes had ever seen. The plant Whitney was building matched the ambition. 400 coke ovens, 10 50-ton tilting open hearth furnaces, blast furnaces to reduce the ore, rolling mills to shape the steel, At completion, contemporaries called it the most modern steel plant in the world. The physical footprint sprawled across the south side of the harbor, a landscape of fire and smoke and iron that dwarfed every other structure in eastern Nova Scotia. There was, however, a problem that no amount of capital could purchase away. Whitney and his associates, for all their financial sophistication, were not steel experts any more than they were coal mining experts. They'd built a streetcar company, run steamships, practiced law, shuffled bonds. None of them had operated a blast furnace. And the gap between financial vision and metallurgical reality proved brutal. The Cape Breton coal, so abundant and so cheap, contained sulfur levels that made it unsuitable for the Bessemer steelmaking process they'd originally planned. The Wabana ore was low-grade, rich enough to be worth mining, but full of impurities, phosphorus chief among them, that would plague the operation for 6 decades. The combination of high-sulfur coke and impure ore meant that Sydney Steel would always be fighting its own raw materials. Every heat was a negotiation with chemistry. The cost overruns were staggering. By one contemporary estimate, the plant could have been built for 2/3 of what was actually spent. $7 to $8 million, wasted on wrong decisions, redesigns, equipment that didn't suit the materials, and the 1,000 small discoveries that happen when amateurs build something this complex. In 1901, when a skilled worker earned perhaps $1.50 a day, that kind of money represented a generation's wages. The first steel was produced on December 31, 1901, rushed to the wire to technically meet the 1901 target, as though the calendar could validate what the balance sheet could not. And within months, the man who'd built it all was gone. Henry Melville Whitney resigned as president of SYSCO in 1902. Less than a year after the first steel poured. His daughter explained it later with a candor that sounds almost affectionate. He loved to develop things. After it was all developed and going, he was not interested anymore. He sold control to James Ross, a Montreal railway builder and financier who saw value in the assets, if not in Whitney's management. And Whitney walked away from Cape Breton the way he'd walked into it, on his own terms, at his own pace, answerable to nobody who lived there. When he died in 1923, the New York Times reported with evident surprise that the estate of the supposed multi-millionaire was worth exactly $1,221. The man who'd built the largest steel operation in the British Empire had, in the end, not even profited from it. He'd spent the money, staked the bet, and left the people of Sydney to live with the results. It was the founding pattern of this place. Built by someone from away, controlled by someone from away. And when the builder lost interest, sold, abandoned, moved on, it was the community, not the investor, that carried the cost. Whitney was the first to leave. He wouldn't be the last. Chapter 3. Rails, Blood, and the Wolf. What Whitney left behind was a steel plant with chronic quality problems, an ownership structure already migrating away from Cape Breton, and a workforce growing into one of the most militant in the country. Over the next 5 decades, the story of Sydney Steel would be driven not by the people who lived beside the furnaces, but by distant owners who treated it as a line item, and by the workers who bled, organized, and sometimes died, trying to force those owners to see them. The plant found its product early. In 1905, a rail mill began production, and rails became Sydney's defining output, the product it would make, in one form or another, for nearly 100 years. Rails suited an operation cursed by impure inputs. The rolling process could tolerate chemical inconsistencies that structural steel shapes could not, and Canada's railways were expanding at a pace that consumed every rail the mill could produce. The Intercolonial Railway, the Grand Trunk, the Canadian Pacific, all needed rail, and the tariff wall meant they bought Canadian. Sydney Rails connected Halifax to Montreal, Toronto to Winnipeg, the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was, for a time, the invisible infrastructure of a nation being stitched together. In 1907, 2 Bessemer converters were added to fight the lingering impurities. The corporate structure reshaped. By 1909, Whitney's remaining financial interests were sold at a handsome return. The Boston speculator made his money on the exit, even if he hadn't made it on the operation, and the coal and steel companies merged into the Dominion Steel Corporation. A new blast furnace, a rod and bar mill, and a wire and nail mill broadened the product range. Sydney was growing into a genuine steel-making town, not an experiment anymore, but a functioning operation feeding the railway boom and the construction surge of a young country building itself out of wood and iron and ambition. Then came the First World War, and for 4 years, Sydney Steel found the purpose that peacetime had never quite provided. From 1914 to 1918, the war effort took everything the plant could make. Steel output reached roughly 300,000 tons annually. Munitions, railway stock, the structural steel that kept the Allied supply chain from collapsing. A plate mill was constructed in 1918 to produce steel for wartime shipbuilding, feeding the yards that were turning out the cargo vessels and escorts the Atlantic convoys desperately needed. Employment surged toward 3,000. For workers who'd known the uncertainty of boom and bust cycles since the plant's founding, the war brought something unfamiliar: steady demand, full shifts, and the knowledge that what they were making mattered to something larger than a balance sheet. The armistice ended all of it. The plate mill was mothballed almost immediately. Peacetime Canada had no need for plate steel from Cape Breton, and the wartime orders evaporated. It was a lesson the community would learn twice: that the plant ran best when the world was at war, and that the peace that followed always brought the question nobody wanted to answer. Can this plant survive on its own? Before that question could be settled, a different kind of war arrived. One fought not overseas, but on Victoria Road, and in the coal towns of Glace Bay and New Waterford. In 1920, a consortium of Montreal financiers created the British Empire Steel Corporation, BESCO, an entity that absorbed DISCO, the Nova Scotia Steel and Coal Company, the Wabana ore mines, and the Halifax shipyards into a single over-leveraged monopoly. The man who ran it was Roy Wolven, a Montreal financier, whose name still carries a particular weight in Cape Breton. The workers called him the Wolf. It wasn't a compliment. BESCO was loaded with debt from the day it was constituted, and Wolven's response to every shortfall was the same: cut wages, stretch hours, resist every demand from the shop floor. The men who poured the steel and dug the coal were, in Wolven's calculation, the most adjustable variable on the ledger. The steelworkers had been organizing for years, but under BESCO, the friction became something harder. On June 28, 1923, the steelworkers struck. BESCO's management did what maritime industrial employers had done for a generation. They called in the state. 350 soldiers of the Royal 22nd Regiment, with 74 horses, were dispatched from Halifax. The regiment was francophone, French-Canadian troops sent to police English-speaking Cape Breton workers, a detail that carried its own colonial echo. And on July 1, 1923, provincial police charged the strikers and bystanders along Victoria Road, driving them into the streets of Whitney Pier. The Maritime Labour Herald, the workers' own newspaper, called it a reign of terror. The community called it Bloody Sunday. The date, Canada's national holiday, made the irony impossible to miss. The coal miners struck in solidarity. Their leader was J.B. McLaughlin, a Scottish-born organizer who'd arrived in Cape Breton decades earlier and had committed himself, body and reputation, to the miners' cause. McLaughlin was a communist in a country that distrusted communists, but his moral authority in the coalfields was absolute. When he published an account of the police violence in the Maritime Labour Herald, graphic, unsparing, calling it what it was, he was arrested and convicted of seditious libel. The conviction made him a martyr among the workers. It also demonstrated, with a clarity that no labor textbook could match, who the law was written to protect. 2 years later, the violence found its sharpest point. During the 1925 coal strike, company police shot and killed William Davis on a picket line. Davis was a young miner. His death transformed Cape Breton's labor movement. June 11th became Davis Day, commemorated annually for decades, a reminder etched into the region's calendar that the coal and steel underwriting Eastern Canada's economy had been paid for in more than wages. These struggles, Bloody Sunday, McLaughlin's arrest, Davis's killing, Years of picket line confrontation in the coldest corner of industrial Canada laid the groundwork for change that would matter. Nova Scotia passed the Trade Union Act in 1937, establishing legal protections for workers organizing. The following year, United Steelworkers of America Local 1064 was formally recognized at the Sydney plant. The first contract was signed in 1940. It had taken nearly 4 decades of strikes, troops, beatings, and a killing to win the right to bargain collectively. The price had been paid in human terms that no corporate annual report would ever acknowledge. SYSCO itself hadn't survived the fight. The company collapsed into receivership in 1927, dragged down by the debt Wolven had loaded onto it. It was reorganized in 1928 as the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation, SYSCO, under new management and backed now by British capital. The wolf was gone. But the pattern remained. Someone from away owned the asset, and someone from Cape Breton worked it. The Second World War arrived in 1939, and the mothballed plate mill was recommissioned. Once again, the plant found its wartime rhythm. Sydney supplied plate steel for the merchant ships and escort vessels that kept Britain's Atlantic lifeline open, the convoys that carried food, fuel, and munitions from North America to a besieged island. Sydney Harbor itself became one of the most strategically vital ports in the Atlantic. Over 7,500 ships assembled there during the war years, loading, forming up, and departing in convoy into waters where German U-boats hunted. A 10-ton electric arc furnace was added in 1942 for specialty steel. Employment climbed again. Cape Breton's economy, chronically fragile in peacetime, ran hot on wartime demand for the second time in a generation. The plant was doing what it had always done best, producing at capacity because a distant crisis demanded it. But the war exacted a toll that went beyond production quotas. German U-boats stalked the waters between Bell Island and Sydney, targeting the ore ships that carried Wabana iron to the blast furnaces. In 1942, 4 ore carriers were torpedoed and sunk on that run. About 70 men went down with them, most of them Cape Bretoners, men whose daily work had been to move the raw material of their own industry across a stretch of Atlantic that the war had turned into a killing ground. Their names would join a list that grew, year by year, to 308. The final count on the Steelworkers Memorial Monument, erected in 1986, of every worker killed at the Sydney steel operation between 1901 and 2003. 308 names. A century of risk, written in bronze. One wartime-era achievement deserves its own space. In 1931, a SYSCO metallurgist named I.C. Mackey had invented the Mackey-retarded cooling process, a technique for controlling the rate at which freshly rolled rails cooled, eliminating the hydrogen shatter cracks that plagued rail producers worldwide. The process worked brilliantly. It worked so well that SYSCO rails, produced from the same impure Cape Breton coal and Newfoundland ore that had cursed the plant since its founding, became internationally recognized as the world's finest rail. An operation built on the wrong coal and the wrong ore had, through the ingenuity of one man working inside its walls, turned its liability into an advantage. It was the kind of breakthrough that might have anchored a competitive future. A proprietary process, a premium product, a reputation earned through metallurgical innovation rather than purchased through government subsidy. But the Mackey process became a footnote in the larger story, a bright moment in a narrative that was already bending toward something the wartime boom couldn't disguise. Because even as the harbor filled with convoys and the blast furnaces burned through Cape Breton nights, the structural vulnerabilities hadn't changed. Sydney was still 1,000 kilometers from its primary markets in Ontario and Quebec. The ore still crossed open ocean by ship. The coal still carried its sulfur. The owners still sat in offices far from the plant gates. And the plant, for all its wartime utility, was aging. Its open hearth furnaces, a generation behind the basic oxygen technology that would soon reshape steelmaking worldwide. By 1945, the plant had proved what it could do when the world needed steel badly enough to overlook distance, cost, and scale. Peacetime would ask a different question. Could Sydney compete when the urgency was gone, when the border was close, And when Hamilton's Stelco and Dofasco, newer, larger, closer to the customers, were already modernizing? The men walking out through the plant gates in the autumn of 1945, blinking into the maritime light after years of round-the-clock wartime production, had earned the right to believe the answer was yes. Their fathers had poured the first heat. They'd survived the Wolf and Bloody Sunday and the U-boats. They made the world's finest rail. Some of them had worked beside their own fathers and now watched their sons signing on. They couldn't see what was coming. Nobody could. But the distance between Sydney and Hamilton, the distance between Cape Breton and the boardrooms where the next decisions would be made, hadn't shrunk. And in the decades ahead, that distance would matter more than all the steel they'd ever poured. Chapter 4. The Furnace and the Floor. Imagine arriving for the morning shift at the Sydney steel plant in the winter of 1955. You've left your house in Whitney Pier while it's still dark. The sun won't clear the horizon for another hour, and the temperature has been below -15 for a week. The street is quiet, except for the sound of boots on packed snow and the distant low hum that you've heard every morning of your working life. You can smell the plant before you can see it. The sulfur comes first, that sharp, acrid bite that catches the back of your throat and tells you the coke ovens are cooking, which they always are, every hour of every day. Then the ore dust, a finer note underneath, almost metallic. By the time you reach the gates, your breath is freezing in your eyebrows, and your fingers inside your gloves have started to stiffen. You punch your card, you walk through, and inside, the world reverses itself. The blast furnace throws heat that can blister paint at 12 meters, and men nearest the pour strip to their undershirts in a building where the outside temperature would kill you in hours. That contrast, Cape Breton winter against the inferno of molten steel, defined the physical reality of working at Sydney Steel for half a century. The plant in the mid-1950s was a world unto itself. On the south side of Sydney Harbour, it sprawled across hundreds of acres in a complex that functioned like a small industrial city. 3 blast furnaces reduced the iron ore, brought by ship from Wabana on Bell Island until 1966, and later from Quebec, into pig iron. Roughly 120 modern coke ovens, arranged in long batteries, baked Cape Breton coal into coke 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The ovens had been burning continuously, with interruptions only for maintenance since the plant's earliest years. The heat they generated was visible from a distance. At night, the sky above Sydney carried an orange glow that residents on Kelly's Mountain, kilometers away, could see against the clouds. It was the town's signature, proof that the furnaces were running, that the shifts were changing, that the paychecks would come. From the coke ovens and the blast furnaces, the molten iron moved to a 700-ton metal mixer, a vessel large enough to hold the output of multiple furnace runs, and then to the 6 open hearth furnaces, each rated at 200 tons. The open hearths were the workhorses, the technology that had been at the plant's core since 1901. Each one ran on a cycle measured in hours. Charge the furnace with pig iron and scrap, heat it to steel-making temperature, skim the impurities, test the chemistry, and tap the heat when the steel was ready. The men who worked the open hearths, the first helpers, the second helpers, the pitmen, operated in conditions that would make a modern safety inspector close the building. The radiant heat near a furnace door during tapping was intense enough that workers wore face shields and heavy leather aprons, and even then you learned to turn your body sideways to the pour, minimizing the surface area exposed to the blast. When a heat was tapped, the molten steel ran in a white-orange stream into ladles that moved on overhead cranes toward the blooming mill, where the first rough shapes were pressed from ingots. From there, the steel moved through billet mills and into the rail finishing mill, or the rod and bar mill, or the wire and nail mill. Each department a distinct operation with its own rhythms, its own hazards, and its own men. A rail left the finishing mill at a controlled temperature, the Mackey retarded cooling process, ensuring that the hydrogen that had plagued the industry was held in check. The finished product, smooth, heavy, precisely gauged, was stacked in the rail yard for shipment by rail to central Canada or by ship from the harbor. The sound never stopped. The blast furnaces roared with a deep, continuous note that the workers' families could hear in their kitchens. The rolling mills clattered with a rhythmic, percussive crash as steel met steel. The cranes hummed. The coke ovens, when they were pushed, when the incandescent coke was forced out of the oven chambers into quenching cars, sent a visible shockwave of heat and gas into the air that could be felt 100 meters away. Overlaying everything was the ventilation system fighting a losing battle against the fumes, the clang of hand tools, and the shouts of men communicating over noise levels that would cost many of them their hearing by retirement. And outside, beside Mugga Creek on the plant's southern boundary, a mountain of slag grew. The waste product of every heat, the impurities pulled from the ore and coal that Whitney had brought together half a century earlier. The slag pile was a monument to the plant's chronic battle with its own raw materials, and it grew year by year, a dark artificial hill rising beside the tidal creek that received the runoff from the coke ovens. Nobody talked about the runoff. Not yet. By the mid-1950s, nearly 5,400 men reported for work at the plant in an average year. In 1952, hourly employment hit its peak. 5,252 workers passing through those gates across 3 shifts, around the clock, every day of the year. Add the coal miners who fed the coke ovens, DOSCO's Cape Breton collieries still employed thousands, and the total industrial workforce in coal and steel exceeded 16,000. It was the largest concentration of heavy industrial employment east of Hamilton. It was, for Cape Breton, the economy itself. Chapter 5. The Pier. The neighborhood that the plant built was called Whitney Pier, and it was unlike anything else in the Maritimes. Named for the man who'd started it all and then left, the pier sat directly beside the steelworks, close enough that ore dust settled on windowsills and the sulfur smell permeated laundry hung out to dry. In 1891, before the plant existed, the area held perhaps 500 people. By 1903, after 4 years of construction and the first steel pours, it had grown to 4,000. By 1913, Whitney Pier held 8,000 residents, a working-class neighborhood that had assembled itself, block by block, to house the men who fed the furnaces and their families. What made the pier remarkable wasn't its size, but its composition. The plant had drawn workers from across the world, and they'd settled in clusters, each community establishing its own streets, its own institutions, its own place within the neighborhood's geography. Polish and Ukrainian families centered around the micro-community called Colonia, a district of perhaps 300 residents with its own shops and gathering places. St. Mary's Polish Church served one congregation. Holy Ghost Ukrainian Catholic Church served another. Italian families had their own networks, their own food, their own feast days. Irish workers brought the Catholicism and the industrial experience of a people who'd been building things for colonial masters since before Confederation. Jewish families established businesses along the commercial streets. And then there was the black community, Barbadian and Caribbean immigrants who'd arrived alongside the European workers in the plant's first decade, alongside African Nova Scotians, whose roots in the province went back generations. At its peak in the 1920s, the black population of Whitney Pier numbered around 600. They'd built St. Philip's African Orthodox Church and the Uniah Hall, the local branch of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which had a presence in Cape Breton that most Canadians have never heard of. Garvey himself came to Whitney Pier in October 1937 and spoke at the hall. Some of the lines he delivered that night, about mental slavery and emancipation, would, decades later, echo in Bob Marley's Redemption Song. The connection runs from a steelworkers' neighborhood in Cape Breton to a recording studio in Kingston, Jamaica, and almost nobody knows it. These communities lived beside each other in the way that working-class immigrant neighborhoods have always functioned, not in some idealized harmony, but in the daily negotiation of shared space. The factory floor was the common ground. Polish workers and Barbadian workers and Irish workers and Italian workers shared the same shift rotations, the same hazards, the same paycheck cycle. English was the language of the plant, but the accents on the floor ranged from the broad maritime vowels of the local-born to the clipped consonants of Eastern Europe to the Caribbean lilt of the Barbadian workers. Lunch hours in the break room were a geography lesson. You could hear 4 languages in a single conversation about the previous night's hockey game. The rhythm of life in Whitney Pier was the rhythm of the plant. The morning shift whistle, 6 o'clock, woke the neighborhood more reliably than any alarm clock. Wives packed lunch pails. Children walked to school past the plant gates, stepping around the workers coming off the night shift. Men gray with fatigue and ore dust heading home as the day shift headed in. Payday shaped the commercial district. The shops along Victoria Road did their heaviest business on Fridays. The Legion Hall, the union office for USWA Local 1064, the hockey rinks, the church basements. These were the institutions that held the community together between shifts. A steelworker's wages in the 1950s could buy a modest house in the pier, a used car, hockey equipment for the children, and perhaps a week's holiday somewhere on the island in summer. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. And in the Maritimes in the 1950s, stability was not something you took for granted. Multi-generational employment was the norm, not the exception. Fathers brought sons into the plant the way they'd been brought in by their own fathers. A family might have 3 generations pass through the same gates. The grandfather who'd arrived from Poland or Barbados or Ireland in the 1900s. The father who'd worked through the Depression and the war. The son who signed on in the 1950s, expecting to do the same for the next 30 years. The plant wasn't just an employer. It was the institution around which the community's entire social architecture was built. Weddings, funerals, christenings, retirements. They all orbited the fact of the plant, the reality that nearly every family in the neighborhood drew its income from those furnaces across the road. What the neighborhood couldn't escape, even in the best years, was what came with living beside a steelworks that operated without pollution controls. Jean Crawley, a Whitney Pier resident, remembered the stench from the ponds and the clouds of red ore that wafted above her home. The ore dust, fine, rust-colored, pervasive, settled on everything. A 1959 dustfall study by researchers Katz and McKay documented what the residents already knew. That particulate deposition over Whitney Pier was heavy enough to coat surfaces, discolor laundry, and create a chronic low-grade irritation that people learned to live with because they had no alternative. From a distance, the plant was the orange glow on the horizon. Up close, it was a neighbor that never slept and never cleaned up after itself. In 2015, Whitney Pier was designated a National Historic Event, recognized as a symbol of Canada's rich diversity. The designation honored what had been built there, not just a steelworks, but a community assembled from the edges of the world, held together by shared labor and shared geography, and carrying within it a human complexity that no plaque can fully capture. Chapter 6. The World's Finest Rail. By the mid-1950s, Sydney Steel occupied a position in the Canadian industrial landscape that was both commanding and precarious, though almost nobody on the shop floor would have used the second word. The numbers told a story of scale. Ingot capacity had reached 877,000 tons by 1950 and would climb to 1,050,000 tons by the end of the decade. The product range, rails, rods, bars, wire, nails, served the railway companies, the construction industry, and the infrastructure boom of a post-war Canada that was building suburbs, highways, and pipelines as fast as the steel could be delivered. The rail mill, the plant's flagship, produced rails that carried the Mackey process certification, the world's finest rail, a claim backed by metallurgical evidence and accepted by railway engineers across the country. Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and the smaller regional lines all laid Sydney rail. The product that had emerged almost by accident in 1905, when the plant needed something its impure steel could make, had become a source of genuine pride. A rail rolled in Cape Breton might end up beneath a passenger train crossing the prairies, or under a freight consist hauling grain from Saskatchewan to the port of Thunder Bay, the invisible infrastructure of a nation made on the Atlantic shore. When the coal mines were included in the picture, the scale of Cape Breton's industrial contribution was staggering for a region its size. Coal and steel together employed over 16,000 workers at their peak, in a part of the province where no other industry came close. SYSCO was not just the dominant employer. It was the economy, the tax base, the reason the towns existed. Remove the coal and the steel, and what remained was a coastline, a harbor, and a landscape that the rest of Canada would have had no particular reason to visit. The product's reputation extended beyond the domestic market. Sydney rails were exported, and the Mackey process was studied by steelmakers in other countries trying to solve the same hydrogen embrittlement problem. For a plant that had fought its raw materials since the day Whitney lit the first furnace, the rail was a triumph of adaptation, proof that you could take impure ore and high-sulfur coal and, through ingenuity and persistence, produce something that not only competed, but led. The men on the rail mill floor knew this. The first helpers and the rollers and the finishing crews took a craftsman's pride in the product that bore no individual name, but carried the accumulated skill of 3 generations. What the pride concealed, what the strong numbers and the full order books made easy to ignore, was the technology beneath the production. The open hearth furnaces that had been the plant's steelmaking core since 1901 were, by the 1950s, a generation behind what was happening elsewhere. Across the Great Lakes in Hamilton, Stelco and Dofasco were modernizing, moving toward basic oxygen furnaces that could produce steel faster, cheaper, and with better consistency than the open hearth method that Sydney still relied on. In Japan, in Europe, in the American Midwest, the steel industry was transforming itself. Electric arc furnaces were coming. Continuous casting was coming. The old way, charge the open hearth, wait hours for the heat, tap it, repeat, was becoming obsolete. But in Sydney, the open hearths kept running because they were what the plant had, and nobody with the authority to replace them showed any inclination to spend the money. It was the branch plant problem in its most insidious form. The profits, such as they were, flowed to SYSCO's corporate offices, first in Montreal, later in Hamilton. The capital investment decisions were made by managers who balanced Sydney against their other operations across the country, and increasingly, the balance tilted away from Cape Breton. Why pour money into an aging plant at the edge of the continent when the same capital could modernize a facility in Ontario, closer to the customers, closer to the markets, closer to the future? The workers didn't see the ledger. They saw full shifts, regular paychecks, and a product they were proud of. And for the moment, that was enough. Chapter 7. The Summit. In 1969, the Sydney Steel Plant produced 1 million tons of steel in a single year. It was the first time the operation had reached that figure, a milestone that had seemed unimaginable in the early years when the plant couldn't even make its raw materials behave, and that now, in a year of strong orders and steady production, arrived with a sense of culmination. For the first and only time in the plant's history, an employee dividend was paid. The men who'd poured the steel, rolled the rails, maintained the coke ovens, and kept the blast furnaces running, received a share of the year's success. It was a gesture that acknowledged something everyone on the floor already knew, that the million-ton year was their achievement, earned through skill and endurance, and that without their labor, the number was just a target on a piece of paper in a corporate office somewhere. It was also, though nobody standing on the shop floor that year could have known it, the highest point the plant would ever reach. The symmetry is difficult to look at from this distance. The year the plant finally hit 1 million tons was the year everything beneath the surface was already shifting. The Wabana ore mines on Bell Island had closed 3 years earlier, in 1966, after decades of declining reserves. The iron ore that had once crossed the Cabot Strait from Newfoundland, the ore that Whitney had built his entire logic around, now had to come from Quebec, by rail, at greater cost. The coal mines that fed the coke ovens were themselves in managed decline. The federally appointed Donald Commission had examined the Cape Breton coal industry in 1965 and recommended winding it down, assuming the Sydney mines will not operate beyond 1981. The fuel and the feedstock that had made the original case for Sydney Steel, the convergence that Whitney had called the best in the world, were either gone or going. And since 1957, the plant had been owned by a company that viewed it as a problem, not a prize. Hawker Siddeley, the British conglomerate, had purchased SYSCO that year. The sole dissenter at the shareholder vote was Frank Sobey, the Nova Scotia grocery magnate who held 20% of DOSCO shares and warned, publicly and forcefully, that Hawker Siddeley had a poor corporate record in Canada and that selling was not in the community's interest. Sobey was dismissed. The financial press treated his objection as sour grapes, the complaint of a minority shareholder who'd lost a vote. But Sobey had read the new owners correctly, as the Sydney Steel Museum would later put it, with a bluntness unusual for a heritage institution. It soon became apparent that Hawker Siddeley was not interested in making steel, only in making money. When capital investment was needed, their policy was to shut it down or sell it. The million-ton year, then, was the summit of a mountain that was already crumbling from the base. The open hearths were old. The competitors were modernizing. The ore came from farther away at higher cost. The coal industry that had birthed the steel industry was being deliberately wound down. And the owner, sitting in London, running a global conglomerate with interests in aerospace, railway equipment, and heavy engineering, had no particular reason to pour capital into a steel plant on a Canadian island that was losing competitive ground with every passing year. The men who earned that dividend didn't know any of this. They knew their craft. They knew the product was good, the world's finest rail, certified and proven. They knew the furnaces were hot, the order book was full enough, and the paycheck was there on Friday. They walked out through the plant gates in 1969 with the quiet satisfaction of a job done well, a milestone reached. What they couldn't know, what nobody in that town could see clearly enough to act on, was that the million-ton year wasn't a foundation. It was a peak. And somewhere in London, in a boardroom they'd never see the inside of, someone was already running the numbers on how much it would cost to walk away. Chapter 8. The Slow Freeze. The decline of Sydney Steel didn't begin with a single decision. It was structural, written into the plant's geography, its ownership, and its technology, from a date far earlier than most people in the community would have believed. Lachlan McKinnon, the historian whose book Closing SYSCO remains the definitive account of the operation's final decades, traced the deterioration to almost immediately following the First World War. The wartime boom masked it. The Second World War masked it again. But between those booms, and steadily after the second one ended, the fundamentals were moving against Cape Breton steel with a slow, grinding certainty that no single rescue could reverse. The problems were specific, and they were cumulative. Start with distance. Sydney sat 1,000 kilometers from the industrial heartland of Ontario and Quebec, where the steel was actually consumed. Every rail, every rod, every coil of wire had to travel by rail or by ship to reach the customers who needed it. Hamilton's Stelco and Dofasco, Sydney's primary domestic competitors, sat on the western end of Lake Ontario, within a few hours' drive of Toronto, within easy shipping distance of the entire Golden Horseshoe manufacturing corridor. A steel buyer in Ontario could order from Hamilton and have delivery in days. The same order from Sydney meant a longer haul, higher freight costs, and a logistical chain that ran through some of the least developed rail corridor in eastern Canada. Then, the raw materials. The Wabana ore from Bell Island, the feedstock Whitney had built his entire case around, was exhausted. The mines closed in 1966 after decades of declining quality and rising extraction costs. Iron ore now had to come from Quebec's North Shore by rail, at greater distance and expense than the short sea crossing from Newfoundland had ever required. The coal was still there, beneath the Cape Breton hillsides, but the Federal Donald Commission had examined the coal industry in 1965 and recommended its managed decline, projecting that the Sydney mines will not operate beyond 1981. The two inputs that had made the original location logic work, local coal and nearby ore, were either gone or going. And then the technology. The open hearth furnaces at Sydney, 6 of them, each rated at 200 tons, represented steel making as it had been practiced in the early 20th century. By the 1960s, the rest of the world was moving on. Basic oxygen furnaces could produce a heat in 40 minutes. The open hearths took 8 to 12 hours. Electric arc furnaces, fed by scrap steel, were emerging as a viable alternative for smaller-scale operations. Continuous casting, pouring molten steel directly into semi-finished shapes rather than first making ingots, was eliminating an entire step in the production chain. Hamilton was adopting these technologies. Japan had rebuilt its entire steel industry around them. Sydney's open hearths, unchanged in their essential design since before the First World War, were running on borrowed time. The question was, who would pay to modernize? And the answer, since 1957, had been nobody. Hawker Siddeley, the British conglomerate that had acquired SYSCO, treated the Sydney operation exactly as Frank Sobey had predicted. McKinnon's analysis is precise. SYSCO under Hawker Siddeley failed to modernize, not through simple folly, but because diversification and expansion did not fit within the framework that SYSCO had chosen for itself. The framework was clear. Invest in central Canada, expand where the markets were growing, and slowly extricate from the Maritimes. The capital that could have replaced Sydney's open hearths with basic oxygen furnaces went instead to operations closer to Toronto and Montreal. The plant that made the world's finest rail was allowed to age in place, its competitive position eroding with every year that the investment didn't come. Every absentee owner had done the same thing. Whitney built it and left. The Montreal financiers merged it, leveraged it, and let Wolven strip it. British capital reorganized it and looked away. Now Hawker Siddeley was running the final calculation, the one that measured what the plant was worth against what it would cost to keep running, and found the answer wanting. The decisions about Sydney Steel had always been made somewhere else. The consequences had always landed in Cape Breton. Chapter 9. Black Friday. On October 13, 1967, Hawker Siddeley announced that it would permanently close the Sydney steel plant by April 30, 1968. The steel operations would be consolidated at a new facility in Contrecoeur, Quebec, closer to markets, closer to ore supply, cheaper to operate. The announcement was made in a boardroom. The men on the shop floor heard about it the way workers in branch plants have always heard about the end. Second-hand, after the fact, without consultation. Roy Duchemin, the publisher of the Cape Breton Post, wrote an editorial the next morning that captured what the community felt with a precision that corporate language would never match. The Sydney steelworkers, Duchemin wrote on October 14th, stand as the victims of the biggest double cross in Cape Breton industrial history. Hawker Siddeley's shocking decision transcends all bounds of decency and ethics. It was not a measured assessment. It was the sound of a community that understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, what the branch plant arrangement had always meant. The company had no obligation to Sydney beyond the financial. When the financial case closed, so did the plant. But Cape Breton didn't accept it. Not quietly and not passively. On November 19, 1967, more than 20,000 people marched through the streets of Sydney in what became known as the Parade of Concern. Steelworkers in their jackets, coal miners who understood that their industry was next, Royal Canadian Legion branches carrying flags, women's organizations, clergy from every denomination, students from the high schools and the college, 20,000 people in a city of barely 30,000, a turnout that made the march less a protest than a census of everyone who depended on the plant's survival. They marched because there was nothing else to do. The decision had been made in London. The consequences would be lived in Cape Breton. And the only leverage the community had was the weight of its own presence. The visible, physical fact of 20,000 people who had nowhere else to go. 3 days later, on November 22nd, Premier G.I. Smith announced that the province of Nova Scotia would take over the steel operation as of January 1, 1968. The federal government declined to share operating costs beyond the Hawker Siddeley closure date. Ottawa would create DevCo, the Cape Breton Development Corporation, to manage the wind-down of the coal mines, but the steel plant was the province's problem. The Sydney Steel Corporation, SYSCO, was created by an act of the legislature on December 19, 1967. The critical detail, the one that would haunt every government that followed, was this. SYSCO was established to operate SYSCO's steel mill for a period of 12 months until the steel mill could be resold to another private operator. 12 months. a temporary holding action. The province would keep the furnaces running just long enough to find a buyer, and then it would step away. The buyer never came. On March 30, 1968, DevCo expropriated Dosco's coal mines and the Sydney and Louisbourg Railway for $12 million. The coal was now a federal responsibility, managed toward closure. The steel was a provincial responsibility, managed toward a sale that nobody could arrange. And the 12-month commitment that Premier Smith had made, a bridge to private ownership, a gap filler, a temporary measure, began its slow, invisible expansion into something that would consume 3 decades and roughly $3 billion. Chapter 10. 8 premiers and $3 billion. The 33 years of government-owned steelmaking in Sydney were not, in any meaningful sense, an industrial strategy. They were a political holding action, a series of premiers, liberal and progressive conservative alike, managing a plant they couldn't sell, couldn't close, and couldn't make profitable. McKinnon's verdict is unsparing. Public ownership at SYSCO was never really the intention. From the moment of nationalization, the intent was to keep the mill operating only as long as would be possible until a private buyer could be found. The buyer was always expected. The buyer never materialized. And every year the plant ran, the cost deepened. The numbers accumulated with the grim regularity of a debt clock. In 1973, a $92 million modernization added a modern rail finishing mill. In 1975, a continuous caster was installed, the technology that was supposed to bring Sydney into the modern steelmaking era. But the continuous caster was never paired with a basic oxygen furnace because nobody authorized the expenditure. The old open hearths, with their 8 to 12-hour heat cycles, couldn't feed the caster consistently. The modernization was half completed, enough to cost the money, not enough to achieve the result. In 1982, the order book went blank. Amid the worst recession since the 1930s, with no orders on the books and no prospect of new ones, workers staged a walkout. 3,300 men left the plant. It was not a traditional strike. It was closer to a spasm, a collective refusal born of frustration and fear. When the dust settled, only 1,200 came back. The rest, more than 2,000 workers, were gone. In a single convulsion, the plant lost more than 60% of its hourly workforce. The community that had once supported nearly 6,000 steelworkers was now supporting fewer than 1,500. A new blast furnace went into operation in 1984. It never ran at full capacity because, once again, the open hearths couldn't handle its output. The pattern was becoming familiar. Capital invested in one part of the process without the matching investment that would have made it work. Each upgrade was a patch, not a repair. The boldest attempt came in the mid-1980s under Premier John Buchanan. The decision was made to convert the entire operation from the old integrated coke and blast furnace and open hearth system to an electric arc mini-mill, a modern technology that melted scrap steel rather than smelting raw ore, eliminating the need for coke ovens and blast furnaces entirely. The federal government approved financing for a modernization package of roughly $275 million. Between 1987 and 1989, the coke ovens were shut down after nearly 90 continuous years of operation. The open hearths and the last blast furnace followed. An electric arc furnace was commissioned. The workforce was cut again, from over 1,300 to about 750. The plant that had employed nearly 6,000 in 1952 now ran with a fraction of that number, making a different product by a completely different process. In 1990, the province wrote off a $786 million accumulated deficit, effectively absorbing a generation of losses in a single accounting entry, and declared that the modernized plant must show a profit. A private buyer would be sought. The 12-month bridge had lasted 23 years. The cost, so far, was approaching $2 billion. The buyer who came was Minmetals of China. In 1993, Minmetals entered a joint venture with SYSCO, intending to purchase the operation outright within 3 years. For a brief period, the arrangement held Chinese investment, Cape Breton labor, the electric arc furnace producing rails for a global market. But by 1996, Minmetals withdrew. The reasons were commercial. The numbers didn't work. The market had shifted. The plant's competitive position, even with the new technology, wasn't strong enough to justify the purchase price. By the time Minmetals walked away, the workforce had shrunk to perhaps 600, operating spasmodically, and another $203 million in debt had accumulated. 8 premiers presided over this arc. G.I. Smith, who took the plant over, Gerald Reagan, John Buchanan, who authorized the electric arc conversion, Roger Bacon, Donald Cameron, John Savage, Russell McClellan. Each one inherited SYSCO, managed it, failed to sell it, and passed it to the next. None dared close it. The political arithmetic was simple. Cape Breton's votes depended on the plant's survival, and losing Cape Breton could lose an election. The plant was, as McKinnon wrote, a political football for economically depressed industrial Cape Breton. The cost, per the government of Nova Scotia's own accounting, published December 31, 1999, was approximately $3 billion over 30 years. $3 billion for a plant that had never been intended to remain in public hands for more than 12 months. Chapter 11. Frederick Street. The same coke ovens that had made Sydney steel possible, that had baked Cape Breton coal into the coke that fed the blast furnaces for nearly 90 years, had, for all of those years, discharged their runoff downhill into the tidal estuary of Mugga Creek. The plant had operated essentially without pollution controls. Over the course of the 20th century, more than 1 million tons of particulate matter were deposited into the air, the soil, and the water surrounding the plant. And into Mugga Creek, settling in the tidal mud, accumulating year after year in a slow accretion of poison, approximately 700,000 tons of toxic sludge collected, a mass of contamination so large and so dangerous that it would eventually be named Canada's worst hazardous waste site. They called it the Sydney Tar Ponds. The contamination was not abstract. It was chemical, and it was specific. Roughly 3,400 tons of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, the carcinogenic compounds produced when coal is heated in the absence of air. At least 50,000 tons of sediment contaminated with polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes, heavy metals, arsenic, and lead, in concentrations that would have closed the site for remediation decades earlier if anyone with authority had been paying attention. The contamination spread across 3 sites, North Pond, South Pond, and the coke ovens site itself, covering roughly 100 hectares. Harbor lobster, tested by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, showed PAH levels 26 times greater than normal. The lobster fishery was shut down in 1982. The men who'd fished the harbor for generations were told the catch was too poisoned to sell. The human cost was measured in a study that Health Canada scientists Dr. Michel Camus and Dr. Pierre Band conducted over 2 years, examining mortality records from 1951 to 1994. Their finding was stark. Cape Breton County's mortality rate ran 16% above the national average. Camus put the number into human terms. Residents of the area are dying about 16% sooner than they should for their ages, about 10 years before their time. The cancer rate was 16% higher per capita than anywhere else in Canada. A companion study by researchers Vogelers and Guernsey, published in Epidemiology in 1999, found health outcomes in Cape Breton lagging 20 to 25 years behind the rest of the country, with life expectancy in some municipalities reduced by more than 5 years. Soil samples from the tar ponds area would later show that 95% exceeded the Canadian arsenic guideline and 80% exceeded the lead guideline. The human face of these numbers lived on Frederick Street, a residential road running directly above the old coke oven site. In 1998 and 1999, a yellow-orange ooze began seeping into the basements of homes along the street. Testing found arsenic at roughly 50 parts per million, about 4 times the level considered acceptable. Juanita Mackenzie lived on Frederick Street. She would later lose a kidney to cancer. Debbie Ouellette, a mother of 3, demanded that the government relocate her family. Her house was eventually demolished, and she was relocated, the only Frederick Street resident to win a contamination settlement, pursued against former plant owners Domtar and Ispat Sidbeck. Her neighbor, Debbie McDonald, compared the situation to Love Canal. Other residents watched their pets die of cancer. The ooze wasn't a metaphor. It was arsenic, coming up through the ground, into the homes of people who'd lived beside the plant their entire lives. Elizabeth May, then executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada, conducted a 17-day hunger strike on Parliament Hill in May 2001, demanding that the federal government relocate the remaining residents. On the 17th day, Health Minister Alan Rock agreed to act. May and journalist Maud Barlow had already co-authored Frederick Street, Life and Death on Canada's Love Canal, a book that brought the catastrophe to national attention. The community activists who'd been fighting for decades, through the Joint Action Group, through 950 public meetings, and more than 620 technical reports, had finally forced the country to look at what the plant had left behind. Through all of this, the seeping arsenic, the cancer studies, the hunger strike, the steel plant itself was dying its own slow death. Liberal premiers John Savage and Russell McClellan spent the 1990s searching for private buyers. Chinese, Dutch, American, and Swiss-based companies all looked at the operation. All walked away. Progressive conservative John Hamm ran in the 1999 election on a platform that included closing or selling SYSCO, a promise that won him the mainland vote and the premiership. A nominal sale to Rail Associates Limited, a consortium led by US-based S&K Steel, was announced on December 31, 1999, for $30 million. It collapsed. The last rail was rolled on May 22, 2000. After nearly a century, from the first rushed heat on December 31, 1901, to the final product emerging from a mill that had once been the largest in the empire, the plant fell silent. SYSCO's board was disbanded on January 25, 2001. Liquidation began. When Premier Hamm appeared in Sydney, steelworkers booed and jeered him. He told the province, "The taxpayers of Nova Scotia don't belong in the steelmaking business. We are getting out of the business and have put an end to the burden on taxpayers." He wasn't wrong about the burden, but the taxpayers of Cape Breton, the ones who'd breathed the sulfur, lived beside the ponds, buried their relatives earlier than they should have, might have pointed out that they'd been carrying a different kind of burden for considerably longer. In July 2001, SYSCO's electric arc mini mill was sold to Zoom Developers, an Indian company, which dismantled it for shipment overseas. The coke oven structures were demolished. The equipment that had made the world's finest rail was taken apart, crated, and loaded onto ships bound for the other side of the world. Chapter 12. Open Hearth Park. On May 12, 2004, Premier John Hamm and Federal Environment Minister David Anderson stood together and announced a 10-year, $400 million cleanup plan for the Sydney tar ponds and coke oven site. Ottawa would contribute up to $280 million. Nova Scotia would pay $120 million. Hamm said what the occasion demanded. "Today we start writing a new chapter in the history of this strong and proud community. We are determined now more than ever to get this job done." The method chosen, after a joint review panel process that ran through 2006, was solidification and stabilization, mixing the contaminated sediment with cement and Portlandite, capping it with a plastic membrane, and burying it under approximately 2 meters of clean soil. The original plan had included incineration for the most heavily contaminated material, but the review panel dropped that component. The 700,000 tons of toxic sludge, the PAHs, the PCBs, the arsenic, the lead, would not be destroyed. They would be entombed. The cleanup was completed in 2013. Elizabeth May, by then the leader of the Green Party of Canada, called it a cover-up rather than a cleanup. The Joint Review Panel itself had stated during the process that it was not convinced that the solidification charm stabilization technology is proven for use in the tar ponds context. Critics pointed out that contaminated residential backyards had been left unremediated. The contaminants remained in place, sealed beneath a membrane and a layer of earth, in a climate where freeze-thaw cycles test every seal and every membrane eventually fails. What opened on top of it was called Open Hearth Park. named for the furnaces that had fed the ponds for a century. A 39-hectare green space with sports fields, walking trails, a playground, public art, and interpretive panels chronicling the history of the plant. In September 2014, Aerosmith played a concert there. Children now kick soccer balls on grass that grows above a cement tomb containing some of the most concentrated industrial contamination in North America. The population numbers tell the rest. Sydney's population has fallen steadily since the early 1970s. The 2021 census recorded about 30,960 in the city proper. Whitney Pier, the neighborhood that the plant built, dropped from over 8,000 at its peak to 4,612 in 2016. The black community that had numbered 600 in the 1920s was down to 3 by 5. Cape Breton Regional Municipality's population declined roughly 3.2% between 2011 and 2021, with seniors comprising more than a third of residents. The young left. They went to Alberta for the oil patch, to Ontario for construction and manufacturing, to anywhere that had the work Cape Breton no longer did. The outmigration was not a sudden exodus. It was a steady, generational drain. One family at a time, one graduating class at a time, year after year. The economy that replaced steel was smaller and quieter. Tourism, cruise ships docking in Sydney, visitors heading to the fortress of Louisbourg, or the Cabot Trail, or the Celtic Colours Festival. Call centers, attracted by low wages and available labor. Cape Breton University. Healthcare and public services. None of it matched the scale of what had been. None of it could. A steel plant that employed 6,000 workers and sustained an entire regional economy for a century isn't replaced by a call center and a cruise ship terminal. It's replaced by absence, and by the people who stayed and built what they could in the space that was left. The Steelworkers Memorial Monument stands in a small park near the former site. 308 names, etched in bronze, of the men killed at the Sydney Steel operation between 1901 and 2003. The Sydney Steel Museum, run by volunteers on the Steel Plant Museum Committee, preserves the oral histories and the records. The Beaton Institute at Cape Breton University holds the archival material. Lachlan McKinnon's Closing SYSCO, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2020, gave the scholarly account that the community had waited decades for. Careful, documented, unsparing. Chapter 13. What remains? The orange glow is gone. The sky above Sydney Harbour at night is dark now, the way it was before Whitney arrived with his Boston money and his vision of an empire built on coal. The sulfur smell has faded. The coke ovens are demolished. The blast furnaces are rubble. The rail mill that produced the world's finest rail has been dismantled, crated, and shipped to India. The harbor where 7,500 wartime convoy ships once assembled receives cruise liners now. Tourists who photograph the waterfront and drive on to Louisbourg without knowing what used to stand on the south side. Walk through Open Hearth Park on a summer afternoon, and you'll find families on the walking trails, children on the playground equipment, a soccer match in progress on one of the sports fields. The grass is green. The interpretive panels explain what was here, in the careful language of heritage preservation. Beneath the grass, beneath the 2 meters of clean soil, beneath the plastic membrane, the 700,000 tons of contamination sit in their cement matrix. The PAHs, the PCBs, the arsenic, the lead. The poison is still there. It has been sealed, not removed. Contained, not cured. A Boston speculator saw coal and ore in deep water and built the largest steel mill in the British Empire on a harbor at the edge of the country. He left within a year. Montreal financiers leveraged it. A British conglomerate starved it of investment and then abandoned it. A provincial government took it over for 12 months and held it for 33 years, pouring in $3 billion to keep the votes alive. 8 premiers. A parade of 20,000 people who had nowhere else to march. A metallurgist who turned the worst ore in the country into the world's finest rail. A community of Polish, Ukrainian, Italian, Barbadian, Irish, and Scottish families who built something extraordinary beside a plant that was slowly poisoning them. A mother on Frederick Street watching arsenic ooze through her basement floor. A woman on Parliament Hill, 17 days without food, trying to make a country look at what it had done. 100 years of steelmaking, 308 men killed, 700,000 tons of poison buried under a park. The furnace is dark. The silence came in off the harbor a long time ago. And it has stayed.